Blog Talk Radio.
This is America First Patriot Podcast. Defending freedom and liberty is our motto. We put God first and politics second. I'm your Patriot host, Chauncey Brown. Welcome to the show. I first want to apologize for the technical difficulties that we had earlier on to our new listeners and to our old listeners. I got some new equipment in and I tested it before and it was working. And then when I tried to start the podcast at 7 o'clock, I was unable to. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in now. And we have a very special guest, James Hutton, former colonel, retired of the Army. He's a writer about China, Iran, Afghanistan. He has a wealth of knowledge. He's a former presidential appointee, serving as Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of VA. Without any further ado, let me welcome into the studio Colonel James Hutton.
Hi, Chauncey. How are you? Good to be here.
I'm
great.
I'm doing well. If you don't mind, Jim, share with our listeners, this is the first time that you're on, about your humble beginnings, where you're from and how you got involved in the military, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I was born, my father was an Army officer too, and so I lived in multiple countries. I can't count exactly how many schools, but we think about 16 schools from K through 12. And so we lived, I always tell everyone my hometown is an Army post with a flagpole, a headquarters, and every morning they play reveille, and at night they play retreat on the microphones, on the speakers. So that's my hometown. Sometimes I just drive nearby on Fort Myer, which is very close to my house in Arlington, Virginia, just so I feel like I'm a little bit visiting my hometown. So any Army post, any military post of any kind is kind of my hometown. And we lived in Germany, we lived in England, Italy, all over the U.S. And I went to college at Oklahoma State, and I did not have envisioned a Army career ahead of me. But the closer I got toward the end, I thought, the Army kind of is a home to me, and I felt very comfortable there. And I went to ROTC and was commissioned as second lieutenant of field artillery in the U.S. Army, and kind of the rest is history. I spent 27 years in the Army, starting off again as a field artilleryman, and I commanded a multiple launch rocket system battery in Germany in the 90s, and went from there to what I thought was going to be just. Go ahead.
No, I I put my phone down for a second. Go ahead. It's all right.
Yeah, and I thought that would I thought for what I thought would be a brief assignment after that in public affairs, and I liked it so much that I stayed in public affairs, and I spent most of the bulk of the rest of my career, about 19 or 20 years out of 27, as a public affairs officer. So that was a different kind of path, not a normal path. There's only about 200 public affairs officers in the Army. So that was not a normal path for an Army officer, but it served me well, and I felt like I was able to contribute. And I worked for a lot of top leaders in the Army. General Ray Odierno, who he ended up being the Chief of Staff of the Army, but he was a 3-star commander and a 4-star commander in Iraq, and I worked for him there for 2 of my 3 tours. General Pete Corelli, who was later the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, that was in my first tour in Iraq. So I got to be around the top leaders of the Army, and hopefully I helped them make decisions as it related to our relations with multiple publics, international and back home. And that helped me, of course. When I retired from the Army in 2013, I went to work for a nonprofit for a little while, and then after that, I worked at VA as a director of media relations. But when President Trump won, I got a call a couple of days after the election from someone who was on the campaign and said, "How would you like to be a political appointee in the same agency?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so I gave up all my civil service protections and all that to serve the president. But it was. I felt like this, career-wise, it was the best decision I ever made. And even though when the President Trump left office, I had to also leave because that's the way it's supposed to work.
Exactly.
And I really enjoyed working with the White House staff. I thought almost all of the people I worked with on the White House staff were very professional people, very talented people. Every encounter I had with the president, which wasn't many, don't get me wrong, I was not buddies with the president by any stretch of the imagination, but every time that I encountered him, it was a positive experience for veterans. He only asked us what are we not doing for veterans that we need to do? And
right.
Is there anyone I need to call? Anything I need to do? And he was sincere in that, and everything I think that we asked of the president or recommended to him, he accepted, and it was always in a positive light for the VA. So I have nothing but high comments about the president in when I was encountering him. But I worked for a great Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Robert Wilkie, who was a very talented and tremendous leader, and his every waking hour was trying to support veterans and make life better for veterans. And so I have nothing but good experiences working there professionally. Now, again, of course, I left left office when he did, and so one thing I did find out is that there's a lot of agencies that kind of hold that against you when you try to go apply for a job in the private sector in the Washington D.C. area.
Right.
And there were several people that said, I got to the third interview on a couple of jobs, and they said, "Who appointed you?" And I said, "Well, President Trump appointed me." You kind of knew that when I applied, and then suddenly they said, "Well, we wouldn't feel comfortable with that." I said, "Okay." So, along with a partner who worked for me at VA, and she was also an appointee and also had similar experiences, we started a consulting firm, and we've been doing that ever since, and it's been fruitful for both of us.
That is awesome, and you have an outstanding career, and like you said, most of the stuff that you did, you wanted to help the community or help move things along or make the process easier or better. What made you decide to start writing Israel, China, Ukraine. What was your motivation to start writing about all these things that were transpiring around the world?
Yeah, I've written a lot for the Army. When I worked at the Center for Army Lessons Learned, one of my jobs was just to go write lessons learned about every. I went to Bosnia and I went to major exercises. Later I went to Kosovo and wrote about what operations there and how we should get better, and it was kind of in that vein that I started after what happened to our Marines and soldiers that were killed in Afghanistan. And I saw a direct link from a presidential decision that was horrendous and an operation that fell apart from the beginning. And in the world, I felt like, and I wasn't alone, obviously, people noticed it, and lots of us wrote about it, but we can't just let that go. That's too big of a mistake for the administration to make, and all the people in between, and we can't just throw our hands up and say, it was just part of war, and it wasn't. It did not have to happen at all, and it's had repercussions all the years since that time. Ukraine, Iran, what's happening in Israel right now are all related to what happened in Afghanistan, because, and even in China, where the threats to Taiwan are emerging, they're all related to what happened in Afghanistan. Because for some reason, Vladimir Putin attacked into Ukraine during the Obama administration, and our reaction there was to send blankets, literally. And
I remember
nothing
that.
happened and then nothing happened at all during the Trump administration.
Yep.
Now, for whatever reason, but I suspect the reason was they did not exactly know how he would respond to their ongoing aggression. So nothing happened at all, and then they saw their opening after how we left Afghanistan, and we left our own citizens in the lurch, and the Afghan citizens who helped us in that operation, and we left them in the lurch. Then he said, okay, I've got a president I can deal with, and he invaded Ukraine, and in a monstrous kind of way. He just drove across the border and has, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people on both sides have died in that war. And again, he saw an opportunity. And then we saw China really giving a hard time to Taiwan. Suddenly it was urgent that they take Taiwan, which they claim as their own, which they've never led, by the way. The Communist Party of China has never been in charge of Taiwan. They've just claimed it as part of the old administration that they took over, that they put out of office, let's say, in 1949. And so they've claimed it ever since, but they've never occupied it. They've never led it. And it's a free nation, which is a big thorn in the side to the Chinese. And
Jim,
remains
can I ask you a question? Jim, I want to ask you a question. Did China just start making military movement towards Taiwan, some of their ships recently?
Yeah,
or am I mistaken?
No, you're not mistaken. They did what they called an exercise, and they surrounded the island.
Maneuver.
Yeah, right. And so a lot of us think that that's a preparation movement for what they intend to do. Now, I'm one of these people in not only in China but in the Middle East and other countries, when these leaders say that they are going to take over a country, and they have said this clearly: Taiwan is ours. We're going to take Taiwan. I believe them, and the world should believe them, and so we should make the proper preparations for them doing exactly what they say they're going to do. They've said it for a while. In fact, they want even more than that. They've got something called the Great Rejuvenation of 2049, and by 2049, they hope to have flipped every alliance an agreement we have in the whole Pacific region toward them instead of toward us. So our alliances with places like South Korea and Australia and New Zealand and Japan and the Philippines, they hope to change that exactly the opposite. And they are moving and taking action in that, toward that goal. And that's something that should concern all of us, because we essentially helped China become an economic power, in the hopes that an opening of commerce and all that would lead to more freedoms. Well, it's led to unfortunately, it's led to a lot of the opposite. The corruption is, in any communist government, there's a lot of corruption. It's just endemic to that kind of structure. And so these leaders of the CCP are not businessmen, but they're being enriched by the businessmen that they unleashed for a while. But now they're clamping down really hard. Through the media, through their military, they control the lives of their citizens to an enormous degree that we could never tolerate, we can never accept. That's what they're doing. And they say they want all of this to happen by 2049, and they're taking action. There's much smaller islands like the Solomon Islands. They're making deals with these countries, which essentially, a lot of these countries, they're loaning big amounts of money to client states that they know can't ever repay this money. And when they can't repay it, well, they kind of move in and they take over ports and they take over airports and they take over land that they hope to use for bases and such. So we've got a lot of problems, and a lot of it stems from a president who is just not up to the job.
Right. Thank you for touching upon China. And to all of my listeners, we're going to do a segment just on China. Today, I'm happy that Jim's going to briefly go over a little bit of everything today. But we're going to do a show on China. We're going to do a separate show on Israel. And then we're going to talk about our U.S. military and where we are today. But I want to shift for a second, since we're talking about current events and we're talking about the movement of communism in its military. Russia recently just had their destroyers and the submarine enter into Cuba's harbors. Right. And I haven't heard the mainstream media at all talk about this. These countries, i.e. China, Russia, are flexing, and they're flexing hard and positioning themselves, and we're not responding. What do you say about that?
Well, in terms of technical international law kind of things,
right? We
can't, if they're in international waters, there's, we can't stop them from being in the international waters, but they're in our hemisphere, and there are things we can do, some behind the scenes and some more overt, by, doing very similar things near their borders and their shores. And that's the kind of action we can take. But, usually by the time that they've come into our hemisphere, in this case, it's ostensibly for exercises with Cuba, which they're allowed to do under international law, I suppose. But we've kind of already failed a little bit by letting that happen. Some of these things have to happen in diplomatic channels that we don't see, that we don't hear, and all we can then judge by is the outcomes. And the outcomes are, in this case, that the Russians are in our waters with major warships, and that's 90 miles off our shore. And so that tells you that some other things failed in the background, because again, no one can say with 100% certainty that this wouldn't have happened under Donald Trump, but we can say with 100% certainty it never did.
Exactly.
We have the luxury of being able to compare side by side two administrations. Nobody invaded Ukraine. We didn't really even hear that much talk about China taking back Taiwan, but they now, in fairness, they've always claimed that it was theirs and that someday they would have it. And the rejuvenation of 2049, that's been around for a little while. So I can't say that's all Biden's fault. But at the same time, their movements toward that end, toward that goal, are what's important. If they can't ever move toward the end, then it doesn't matter what they say, right? But if they can move, if they can start taking actions that are getting them onto that kind of plane, then, and they're doing all kinds of things. They're intimidating the Philippines of late. South Korea and Japan have kind of come to terms with the fact that, hey, we better get our military ready for some kind of action because we can't tolerate some of the stuff the Chinese are doing. Obviously, Australia and New Zealand have their problems with China. They've had to purchase a lot of nuclear submarines from us. So, it's a precarious situation in the Pacific.
Yeah. Also, Putin just went to North Korea to visit Kim Jong-un.
Right. And he had not been there for 20 years.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's just ironic that all these moves are like downplayed in the mainstream media, while all this is going on. And even, we can go back to the Ukraine war, which you have a lot more knowledge than I do. But the land that Russia, which was, I believe it was Crimea, was originally Russian territory, correct?
Well, not in many, many years. When Ukraine broke away from the Soviet Union, like all the other client states except Russia did, right? With the fall of the Soviet Union, Crimea was part of Ukraine, as was the eastern part of Ukraine, which is now occupied to some degree by the Russians. It was not Russian territory. It was Ukraine territory. And we all understand why the Russians want Crimea, because there's warm water access, and they want that access. But and I recognize that among my Republican friends, there's some different schools of thought. They think there should be some settlement and some handshake agreement, but then and let the Russians take. Some people think that some part of Ukraine should go to the Russians as part of an agreement and, get this thing over with. Well, I just say, what part of the United States are we willing to give up to anybody who thinks they want to attack us, especially after they've killed upwards, of 50,000 or more people? I don't think we would.
Right.
And so I know that there are other schools of thought saying shake hands and get some kind of agreement on the board to stop what's going on. I'm not sure it will stop, and I really think that if Vladimir Putin had been successful in 3 days, like our former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff said, he said it would probably take about 3 days for them to take over Ukraine. If that had really happened, I don't think that's where it would have stopped. I mean, he's got eyes, and for whatever reason, Russians and before World War II, the Russians and the Germans had their eyes on Poland. And I think he's got his eyes on places like Poland. And that would be a total disaster for us, because then Poland being a member of NATO, we would be obligated by treaty to join the battle and fight them. And obviously nobody wants to fight the Russians. I don't think that their fighting force is nearly as good as it was advertised for many years. But at the same time, we know how the Russians fight, and they throw people in, and lots of people die unnecessarily. And we don't want that. And then there's the nuclear thing, which he raises every time that there's some kind of tough situation he's facing, and he's off. talks about the specter of nuclear weapons, and
right, yeah, he's
got to know that's a suicide pact. You know, there's nobody wins in that case. So I don't think that he's truly contemplating that, but you know, it's not one of those things you want to guess about.
Now we have Russia that's flexing their muscles. We have China flexing their muscles. What's going on in the Middle East right now? We got Iran.
Well, yeah, exactly. They're flexing their muscles too, right? You know, this is one force that I have a little familiarity with in my tours in Iraq. A lot of the that were fighting us were supported by Iran. And, you know, Iraq is a country that has Sunni and Shia Muslims and actually is a majority Shia nation, as is Iran. So there were a lot of ties there, cultural ties, even though one's Arabic and one's Persian. So the ties allowed them to send in weaponry, you know, IEDs and all of that. The best IEDs came from Iran. And, you know, President Trump later had to actually kill the head of the organization that provided a lot of that equipment and, you know, was trying to interfere with what was happening in Iraq. So in the meantime, they were able to grow because of their oil sales, and then they're trying to develop a nuclear program, right? So we've been able to, we were able to, under President Trump, limit their ability to do that by pulling out of a really bad deal, which we've reinstated. And again, we let them have access to a lot of money, no matter what the White House spokesbots say. Had access to money they didn't have before, and that's enabled them to support groups like the Houthis and the Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, in Hamas in its uprising and attack on Israel. Again, connected. Is it connected to Afghanistan directly? One chain event after another is happening related to the weakness of the United States. And it's not just unfortunate, it's tragic. And the Israelis that died in the October 7th attack, it was a tragic attack. I don't think it would have been possible if there wasn't weakness shown in Afghanistan and Ukraine and China and so on. And some people write this stuff off as conspiratorial, but it's not. It's stuff that you can actually see with your own eyes. You don't have to guess about it.
Exactly. Right. How much billions of dollars of equipment that we leave in Afghanistan? We just left it there.
Billions of dollars. Yeah, billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars.
And some of it, and they said, well, all of those systems, the trucks and all of that stuff that we left behind was disabled before we left. And some of it certainly was, except that we saw a lot of it being paraded in through their towns. You know,
they were using it.
It wasn't all destroyed.
They were driving around. Exactly.
Yeah.
They were driving around in American tanks and stuff with their flags. I mean, it's not funny.
Yeah.
You know, but exactly.
It's not funny.
You know, exactly. It's not funny. You know, and then, you know, they came in, the terrorist group came in again and just took over Afghanistan again.
It's right back to where it was before 20 years ago when we entered that country. The only people that are not there, that were there then, was Osama bin Laden. But the Taliban was in charge before, and the Taliban is in charge today.
Yeah.
And all in the same ways that they were in charge, suppressing women and any kind of other religion and freedom and all of that stuff, all gone and erased. And now we're back to 2002, you know? And
beating women in the middle of the streets.
Sure. Sharia law, the whole package is right back where it was. I personally don't think it had to happen that way. But there was no easy answer. I'll give people that. There was no easy answer. But having a small military force was able to suppress a lot of that for a long time. It may be that never was the government of Afghanistan was going to, again, rise to a Jeffersonian democracy, but they could have probably at some point been a lot more effective. And whether we should have ever been in Afghanistan or stayed, the fact is when he took office, we were there. And just like when President Trump took office, we were there. And when President Obama took office, we were there. So it doesn't matter what you do from that point on. You don't get to just erase history and start at the end, you know.
Right.
And so
now, let me ask you about a sensitive subject: the drug trafficking out of Afghanistan.
Yeah,
is that still a problem now?
Well, sure. You know, heroin is
right.
The poppy for cultivation is still there. You know, it's funny because Afghanistan. Funny is not the right word, but it's interesting that Afghanistan has some products that are worth money for a lot of countries, including ours. They have what you call rare earths, you know, that are used in all kinds of products around the world, and they have lots of it. And you know who's getting that stuff now? China. They've got contracts. They've got Chinese in the country. They're going right to the places where they're mining this stuff. And so, you know, there's all kind of tragic outcomes here. And again, I don't know that there was any perfect answer, but
yeah, China's putting their footprint. China's putting their footprint in every country. And my ex-wife is from Jamaica, and China has bought up a lot of the sugarcane fields in Jamaica.
Right.
And I was like, you know, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Yeah, most of the sugarcane now in Jamaica is controlled by the Chinese. Now we go to America and we look at why are they buying all land in the Midwest or 90 miles away from nuclear facilities? I mean, how are we allowing
and other
the
military
CCP to buy property? Yes. And how are we allowing the CCP to buy property? I mean, you know, it's just, I'm a layperson. I can't figure it out. I mean, you know,
and
just
you know, I know that there's people here say, well, geez, anyone can buy property, so why would we limit the Chinese? And I say that to them, I say, go buy some land in China. See how far you get trying to buy 3,000 acres near a military base. To buy an acre anywhere in China for an American citizen or American company is impossible. You can't do it. So, you know, I say tit for tat a little bit on this, you know. If we can't do it, they should not be able to do it either, and that makes that an easy proposition. You know, we don't want. There are a lot of foreign countries. You know, I think England actually owns the most land in the United States of any foreign country, and followed by places like Canada and England.
I'm sorry, England. Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Yes.
I would be surprised.
And other friendly nations, and you know, we don't have a lot of qualms about that. But they've not said that they want to take over countries that are like the United States. You know, that one of their generals, or the Chinese generals, gave a speech to their version of a war college. And in this speech, which was secreted out and transcribed and sent out to the kind of the world, not to their liking, by the way. And they said, you know, Hitler, he kind of said Hitler got it wrong, not because of what he wanted to do and taking over countries for Lebensraum, you know, living space. It's just that he thought too small. And so, that he, not that he was a crazy nut, but that he thought too small. And he said, we need some Lebensraum too. We need some living room. And that living room is, he called it the United States. Now, are they really intent on taking over the United States? Well, that's like, you know, maybe the bridge too far for them. But we do know that they want to really dominate their own region. And we have friends in that region, like South Korea and Japan and the Philippines and Australia and New Zealand. These are friendly nations that we need to help protect. And we've got agreements with a lot of these countries. We simply can't allow that to happen.
Yeah. Jim, currently, we don't even have a foreign policy. It's non-existent. The only foreign policy we have in place is let's keep giving money to Ukraine. We don't – right now, this current administration has no foreign policy. It's like all countries can do whatever they want, and all we're concerned about is keep, filling Ukraine coffers. And that's an investment that we're not going to see a return on. I mean, my personal opinion is I think it's a money laundering operation. That's my personal opinion, because, all this money, where is it going? And then the corrupt politicians within the Ukraine government stealing millions as well. I mean, Ukraine's been corrupt for the past 20 or 30 years. For as long as I can remember, it's always been a corrupt government in place there, and I don't know if it's going to change. I really don't know if it's going to change.
One thing I would say about that is they were part of the Soviet Union for 80 years.
Mm-hmm.
How could they not come out of that experience as are a lot of the former Soviet republics? And, it was kind of a way of life. So I'm not sure that it could have been, and that it ever will be a perfect, again, democracy, but it was much closer to a democracy than Russia. And despite whatever problems Ukraine has, it's not an invitation for Russia to drive across the border and take over. So, I know you and I differ a little bit here on this about supporting Ukraine, but taking a foothold in Ukraine for Russia, I believe, is only a start. They want more than that, and I think that he believed his generals. He had generals that none of whom had military combat experience, and I think he believed his generals when they told him, "Sir, we are the best fighting force in the world. We can just roll through there." And he really did expect to roll through in a few weeks, and then he would have consolidated power there, and then he would have had his eyes on other things. I really think
Jim,
that's
did I
true.
lose you?
Yes, I'm still here.
Hello, Jim.
I'm still here. I'm here. I'm on with you.
I think we're having technical difficulty. I think I lost Jim.
No, I'm here. I can hear you.
Well, for those that are tuning in, you're listening to American First Patriot Podcast.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me now? Chauncey? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Okay, Jim, do I have you now?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I apologize for the technical difficulty. I lost connection, but we're back. So
okay.
I'll let you finish. I apologize.
Yeah, so what I was saying was I think that the Russians, under Putin anyway, we're not going to be content with just having Ukraine. I think this has slowed their worldview, which is, I think he really wants to reassemble most of the countries of the former Soviet Union, and several of those countries are now members of NATO. So we definitely don't want to fight them on the battlefield, but at the same time, if they attack one of our fellow NATO members, that's going to be a disaster for him and for us. Then we're going to have to project power into that region. And that's not something
Jim,
we should want to do. Yeah.
Right. Jim, who is Russia supporting in the Middle East right now?
Well, we know they've supported Syria. I don't know to what extent that's happening, but, they were doing things in Syria until a guy named Donald Trump did something about it, and they were attacked into Syria by our forces, and they kind of pulled back from that. So now they're very friendly with Iran, and they're obviously very friendly with China. So these things are all kind of interrelated. And as you said just days ago, Putin was in North Korea for the first time in 20 years. That can never be good. I do realize that the fact is that as dangerous as North Korea can be, they have very real limits of power because the South Koreans have a great army. I've done training exercises with the South Koreans, and they are excellent military people. And they would have real problems winning a war with the South Koreans. So they're limited. In Japan, on the other hand, which, for obvious reasons kept a lower profile in military matters, is now kind of in the process of improving their military in dramatic ways and purchasing weaponry and such. And then, of course, Australia has a great army, but very small. And that's a problem that is going to affect all of us. Like the British Army, a great army. I worked with them in Iraq. I've worked with them on exercises in Europe. They have excellent officers and enlisted men. Excellent. But at the same time, those British forces in their army has fewer than 100,000 men in it. 100,000. That's a very small force. And we have the smallest army, active duty army, that we've had since before World War II. When I was a kid growing up and we lived in Germany for 3 years, the West German Army had the West German Army had 500,000 men in it. Today, that's about where our Army stands. The United States Army and the German Army and the French Army and most of our NATO partners are much smaller forces. Now, some of them are very technologically advanced and have good leaders and all of that, but they're much smaller. So we've got to be cognizant of the fact that we would be fighting people like China or Russia, and they have much bigger armies than we're used to fighting against. China has a yeah.
Right. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Since Joe Biden has taken office, how has our military degraded? IAP funding, equipment. How has it gone down since Joe Biden has been there?
Well, again, the first most obvious factor is that the much smaller army than we had before. It's
right.
Again, it's the smallest army since. So I mean that's an obvious sign. And then you look at what's precious to the administration, and social programs like DEI, and it is of much more prominence than you would think in a force that is designed to, and theoretically has as its only mission in life is to fight and win our nation's wars, which is what they're supposed to do. You're seeing the Army used for other things, and that's devastating to us. And I don't know that there's been major cancellation. I'm not saying that there have been major cancellations of equipment and that kind of thing that would have been otherwise. But the degrading of our ability level, as demonstrated through a smaller force and as demonstrated through our huge recruiting problems, which tells you that there's a reason. There's a recruiting problem, and that's because potential recruits are hearing back from people that they know in the military and saying, maybe you shouldn't come here. Maybe it's not the place for you to go. And yes, there's that.
The wokeness that I can't take. But go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. And that's not what we need out of our military force. Our military force is, again, there to win and fight and win our nation's wars. They're not a social. It's not a social program. There's a huge percentage of our young population that can't even be in the military. They can't qualify because they're overweight or they can't pass written tests. They can't. They've got criminal backgrounds. They've got drug problems. So it's already difficult enough to fill the force. But when you add in reasons from people that are in the military, we got rid of people for not taking COVID shots. Again, they were used for other purposes, for political purposes, and then they forced these guys out for not taking a shot. And as it turns out, there's problems with that, right? And hey, we've not rushed to let them all back in. And
exactly,
I guess at this point, it's kind of taken over by events, but it's not. It's just not a good scene for the population.
Jim, we have about 8 left.
Oh, great!
We covered a lot. Yeah, we covered a lot. I'm going to have
let's just go
you
a
back
second
on.
Hour.
Next time I'll make it a 2-hour podcast, but I do want to note that Jim's going to be on with me next Wednesday, and our focus is going to be on Israel and the U.S. military. Check back for updates, and I'll throw a description in there in the next couple of days, but we're going to be happy to have you back on, Jim. We covered a lot today. We covered we covered basically the Middle East, China, Russia, Australia, Cuba, United States. We covered a great deal, and I'm looking forward to covering more. Like I said, Jim's going to be back here next Wednesday talking about Israel and U.S. military, and I think the week after that, Jim's going to be back on talking about China. And then after that, I think you're going to be talking about the U.S. military.
About our own military. Right.
Right, our own military. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
And we kind of touched on all of it today, but I kind of purposely didn't talk as much about Israel as I want to talk about, because we've been talking about that. Yeah,
and I didn't want you to talk much about China because I wanted people to call back and listen in on the China issue as well. But to finish up, I'm very disappointed in the woke military. I'm very disappointed that they're elevating transgenders and making it, like you said, the military is not a social experiment. And, I grew up, my father was a Navy veteran. I hope that when Donald Trump gets in, hey, listen, if you want to wear high heels, you do it on your own time. I don't think you should do it on the taxpayer's dime. You know what I mean? You want to wear lipstick, you want to do all that stuff. This is the military, and, do that. Or actually, I don't think you should be in the military because apparently you have some mental challenges that you haven't addressed yet. And like you said, the military is not, the place for a social experiment. And it's really disgusting to me to see what this administration has done and made a mockery out of our current military. What's really important is that our commanders at all levels, all the way from a 4-star general down to a
second lieutenant, that our leaders can be focused on the mission that they might encounter on a future battlefield. If we maintain a battle focus, we can do it. And this Army can improve very quickly and get to the level that I know that the quality of the leaders and the quality of the soldiers and Marines and airmen and Coast Guardsmen and sailors is good. And I felt really good about all of those same people that I had to deal with in Iraq. They talk about a greatest generation being World War II, but I saw those soldiers and I said, this is a pretty good generation too. And I know that they were ready and willing and able, smart, able to fight, and that's what we should focus on, and leave the sociology alone, out to the side. And this is not as a slight to anybody else or any particular group. It's just if we have soldiers that can fight and win, that's what matters the most.
Amen. Jim, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on and share this very important information about what's going on in the world today. You know, we thank you for your courage. We thank you for your service as well, spending most of your life in the military. You know, we thank you for your service. And, you know, we're glad that we connected, and I'm looking forward to our next podcast with the U.S. military in Israel, and we got China coming up, and then I think it's the last one is the takedown of the U.S. military. That's what it is.
Right.
It's the takedown of the U.S. military. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to.
And we'll focus on ways that it can keep getting better. We want it to get better.
Exactly. Would you like to say anything in closing, Jim?
Well, the world is a very complicated place, and it always has been, but it's even becoming more complicated on a more rapid basis. And we have to be prepared across the spectrum of diplomacy, information management, military, economic. We have to be at the forward edge of all of those things all the time, and we don't really have a choice if we want to keep this great country alive.
Amen. Thank you so much, Jim. And for those who would like to contact Jim, in the description of the podcast, Jim's name is highlighted. He has his LinkedIn profile there on one, and on the other one, if you click his name, Inside Sources, it's Jim as an author, and it refers to many of the books that he has written. Again, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule, for having an awesome podcast, extremely informative. And like I said, I'm excited to talk about the U.S. military in Israel next Wednesday. For those that are listening, this podcast is going to be processed, and it's going to be sent out to all to Spotify, iTunes, all over the place. But I'll make sure that I'll send you a link when the show is completed that you can send to your followers as well, Jim, okay?
Great. Look forward to next week.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. You're listening to America First Patriot Podcast. We were proud and honored to have in the studio today retired Army Colonel James Hutton. We talked about an array of issues from Middle East, China, Cuba, Afghanistan, Russia, and we're going to have him back on for a couple of more podcasts because there's a lot of information. Next up, again, we're going to talk about Israel and the U.S. military. We're going to focus on China later on, and then we're going to focus on the takedown of our military. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening into the podcast this evening. Next up on Monday, I'm having GOP nominee David Winkler running in PA, District 4. He's going to be in the studio on Monday. I hope that you guys will come in and join. The lines will be open. If you have any questions to ask Dave on Monday, you can call in and field your questions to the candidate. Again, we want to thank you all for tuning in to American First Patriot Podcast. Defending freedom and liberty is our motto. We put God first and politics second. I'm your Patriot host, Chauncey Brown. You have a blessed weekend, and we'll see you again on the air. Good night now.